The heat shimmered off the training ground as the Marines lined up, rifles slung over their shoulders and smirks tugging at the edges of their lips, for they had been told that today's demonstration would include a civilian, a woman no less, and for hardened soldiers who had spent years polishing their skill and identity as marksmen, the idea that someone from the outside would even try to measure herself against them felt laughable. They whispered to one another in tones just loud enough for her to hear, jokes about how quickly she would miss her first target, how the recoil would throw her backwards, how perhaps she had signed up for the wrong event and should have gone to the cooking tent instead of the firing range, and though their words carried the weight of cruelty, she did not flinch or retreat. Instead she walked forward steadily, boots crunching over the gravel, her eyes unshaken, her hands steady as she carried her old but well-kept rifle that once belonged to her father, a man who had taught her to respect the weapon not as a tool of violence but as an instrument of discipline, patience, and unyielding focus. Her name was Elena Carter, and though none of the Marines recognized it, to her small hometown she had been a quiet legend, the girl who could split a playing card in half with a single shot at 200 yards, the girl who could track a deer without disturbing a twig underfoot, the girl whose father had taken her hunting not to kill recklessly but to learn silence, breath, and presence in the wild. She had not come today to prove herself, but because she had been invited by the base commander after hearing of her skill, and though she would have preferred to stay away from spectacle, something in her heart whispered that this was not just another competition but a moment where she might remind a line of proud men that humility lives even at the end of a barrel. The targets had been set at increasing distances, white silhouettes against the backdrop of the distant hills, each demanding precision, each a test that the Marines had practiced for weeks, and yet when Elena stood among them, her slender figure wrapped in a plain shirt and jeans rather than military fatigues, it was as though the earth itself grew quieter, holding its breath to see whether the outsider would falter under the weight of expectation. One Marine, tall and broad-shouldered with a grin full of arrogance, leaned toward his friend and muttered that he hoped she could at least lift the rifle, and when a few laughed, Elena simply glanced at him, her eyes calm, and then without a word she knelt down, laid her weapon across her lap, and began to clean it with the kind of reverence that silenced even those who mocked. Every movement was deliberate, wiping the chamber, checking the sights, running her fingers along the stock as though reminding herself of its history, and in that moment some of the younger Marines felt a strange unease, for they had been taught mechanics and drills, but here before them was someone who treated the weapon like an extension of her very spirit. The whistle blew and the first round began. One by one the Marines stepped up to fire at the closest targets, hitting center mass with disciplined bursts, their shots echoing against the hills. Their instructors nodded in approval, though not surprise, for this was routine work, muscle memory trained over endless hours. When Elena's turn came, she rose smoothly, shouldered her rifle, and without even taking a visible breath, squeezed the trigger. The bullet cracked through the air, and when the dust cleared, the target bore not just a hole in the center but a perfect split along the vertical line, as if the silhouette itself had been neatly cleaved. The Marines blinked. Some whispered that it was luck. Others shook their heads. The commander raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Elena simply stepped back, resting the rifle against her shoulder, waiting with patience while the next shots rang out. The distance increased and so did the challenge. At 300 yards, wind began to tug at the bullets, pushing them slightly off course, and some of the Marines adjusted their stances, correcting for drift, yet their groups began to scatter across the targets, not wild but no longer surgical. Elena watched, listening to the air, tasting the weight of it as she had done 1,000 times in the woods when the leaves trembled and the forest spoke. When her turn arrived, she knelt instead of standing, letting the earth steady her, then exhaled so slowly that time itself seemed to pause. Her shot rang out, and when the spotter called the result, a hush fell, bullseye, dead center. No correction, no scatter. Just precision born of something deeper than practice, born of connection. By the time the targets were set at 500 yards, the Marines had grown restless. Their laughter had dwindled, replaced by tight jaws and narrowed eyes. One cursed under his breath when his round drifted inches off the mark. Another clenched his fists when Elena, once again, sent her bullet exactly where she intended. The commander's face betrayed nothing, yet even he felt a stirring of awe, for this was no ordinary display of skill. This was poetry written in gunpowder, discipline shaped into silence. Elena herself said nothing, offered no gloating, no smile, no reaction beyond the quiet acceptance that this was what she had been trained for since childhood. Not by manuals, not by drill sergeants, but by long hours under the sky with a father who believed that control of the rifle began with control of the heart. When they reached the final test, 1,000 yards across the dusty field, even the Marines looked uneasy. Few of them hit consistent marks at such range. The mirage of heat warped the air, the slightest breath could alter the bullet's path, and though they tried, most shots landed off to the side, respectable but not perfect. Elena waited her turn, closed her eyes for a moment, and remembered the sound of her father's voice telling her that distance was only an illusion, that what mattered was not the space between her and the target but the stillness she carried inside. She opened her eyes, raised the rifle, and the moment her finger pressed the trigger, the crack echoed like thunder rolling through the valley. The spotter's call came seconds later, bullseye, clean and undeniable. The line went silent. No one laughed. No one smirked. Even the arrogant Marine from earlier lowered his gaze, unable to summon another joke. Elena lowered her weapon, not triumphant but serene, and turned to walk back across the gravel. The commander stepped forward, nodded once, and offered a slow clap that carried more weight than any shouted praise. One by one, reluctantly at first, then with growing respect, the Marines joined in until the air vibrated with applause, not for a comrade but for a woman who had reminded them that skill, discipline, and courage knew no uniform, no gender, no boundaries. Elena simply inclined her head, her expression calm, and in that moment she was not just the best shot on the field, she was the silence that taught them all humility. That evening the sun sank low over the base, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and though the day's drills were over, the silence that lingered after Elena's final shot clung to the Marines like a second skin, for they were not accustomed to being humbled in their own domain, not accustomed to the presence of someone who had walked in as an outsider and left them questioning the boundaries of skill and pride. In the mess hall, conversations that would normally roar with laughter and bravado were subdued, the clatter of trays echoing louder than the words of the men who had hours earlier mocked her so freely. The arrogant Marine, whose name was Dawson, sat with his food untouched, replaying the image of Elena's steady hands, the way she had breathed as though the rifle were a living extension of herself, and though he wanted to dismiss it as luck, the memory refused to loosen its grip, gnawing at him with quiet shame. At another table, two younger Marines whispered to each other about how she had not even flinched under their laughter, how she had carried herself as though the weight of their doubt was nothing but dust on her boots, and for the first time in their short careers, they realized that strength was not only built on muscle or rank but on an inner steel that no drill instructor could pound into shape. Elena herself did not join them in the hall. She had been given a small guest quarters, plain and unadorned, and there she sat on the narrow bed with her rifle resting across her knees, cleaning it with the same quiet focus she had shown earlier. To her, the day was not a triumph but simply another test of presence, another reminder of her father's words that humility mattered more than victory. She could still hear his voice, deep and steady, telling her that the world would always try to measure her worth against the standards of others, and that when that happened she should not fight with anger but with proof written in the language of action. As the brush slid through the barrel, she felt a wave of bittersweet memory, the last hunting trip she had shared with him before illness carried him away, his weathered hand resting on her shoulder as he whispered that one day she would stand where he could no longer stand, and she would carry the Carter name not as a banner but as a promise. That promise had echoed with every shot she fired today, and though the applause had been loud, it was not the clapping of the Marines she heard in her heart, it was the faint sound of her father's pride. The next morning, the commander summoned her to his office, a sparsely furnished room with maps lining the walls and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. He was a man hardened by decades of service, his eyes sharp with discipline, yet when she entered, he rose to his feet and extended a hand with genuine respect. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, "you gave my men something they will not forget. I asked you here to test them, to break their routine, and you've done more than that. You've reminded them that mastery demands humility." Elena accepted his handshake with a nod, offering no flourish, only a calm, "Thank you, sir." He studied her for a moment, then added, "There's more to this than pride. We're preparing for a demonstration next month, High Command will be watching, and I want you there alongside my best shooters. Not as a spectacle. As proof that skill speaks louder than rank." Elena hesitated. She had never sought the spotlight, had never wanted to stand on display like a trophy, yet there was something in the commander's tone, something that suggested this was not about politics or showmanship but about reshaping the very mindset of the men she had outshot. After a long silence, she nodded. "I'll come," she said quietly, and the commander's lips curved into the faintest smile. Word of her agreement spread quickly through the base, and with it came a strange transformation. Where once there had been mockery, now there was curiosity. Marines who had laughed at her began to linger near the range when she practiced, watching as she adjusted her stance, controlled her breathing, and fired with unerring precision. Some came forward, at first reluctantly, to ask her advice on controlling nerves, on reading the wind, on finding stillness when adrenaline surged. Elena never spoke with superiority. She demonstrated patiently, explaining that the rifle responded not to force but to balance, not to arrogance but to respect. Even Dawson, the loudest of her critics, found himself drawn to her quiet lessons. One evening he approached while she was packing away her gear, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "You make it look easy," he muttered, and when she glanced at him with calm eyes he added, "It isn't, is it?" She shook her head. "It never is. That's why it matters." Those words lodged themselves in him deeper than he expected, and though pride still bristled inside him, he began to practice with a new discipline, carrying her voice in the back of his mind whenever he raised his weapon. As the days passed, the Marines began to realize that Elena's strength was not in her ability to outshoot them but in her ability to reveal something they had forgotten, that every shot was a mirror of the shooter's heart. She taught them not through lectures but through presence, showing that the silence between breaths mattered as much as the squeeze of the trigger, that rushing or forcing the shot was nothing but noise. In her company, even the most hardened men found themselves remembering why they had chosen this path, not for medals, not for ego, but for the discipline that sharpened the soul. It was during one of these quiet sessions that the commander stood at a distance, watching as Elena instructed half a dozen Marines, and he murmured to his aide, "Do you see? She's done more in 2 weeks than I could have done in 2 years. She hasn't broken them, she's reminded them." The aide, a younger officer, nodded in silent agreement, his eyes reflecting the same awe that had crept into every corner of the base. Yet Elena herself carried no pride in this transformation. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the base settled into quiet, she would walk alone beyond the wire, into the scrubland where the cicadas sang, and there she would sit beneath the open sky, feeling the weight of the stars. She thought of her father often, of the way he had once told her that the world would resist being taught by those it underestimated, and she wondered if this was what he had meant, that her path would not be in proving herself once, but in reminding others over and over again that mastery was not about domination but about grace. Sometimes her chest ached with grief, missing him so fiercely that it felt like a wound that never healed, but when she closed her eyes and let the silence fill her, she could almost feel him beside her, steadying her hand as he once had when she was a child learning to hold the rifle for the first time. It was during one of these solitary walks that Dawson found her. He had followed at a distance, uncertain, and when he finally approached, she looked up from where she sat on the ground, rifle resting across her knees. For a moment he said nothing, just stood there shifting his weight before finally blurting out, "I was wrong. About you. About all of it." Elena studied him quietly, then nodded as though she had expected nothing less. "I know," she said simply, and her lack of judgment struck him harder than any reprimand could. He sank down beside her, staring out at the horizon. "How do you do it?" he asked after a long silence. "How do you make it all so steady?" She turned her gaze back to the stars, her voice soft. "Because when I shoot, it isn't about me. It's about what I carry. My father. His lessons. The silence he left behind. That's what steadies me." Dawson swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavy in his chest, and for the first time he understood that what he had seen on the range was not just skill, it was love woven into discipline, grief turned into strength, the days bled into weeks, and what had begun as a reluctant tolerance of Elena's presence shifted into something far deeper, for the Marines who once joked now sought her out, not because she could outshoot them, but because she carried herself with a balance they could not find within their own hardened shells. The base itself seemed to breathe differently with her around, as though the rhythm of training had been touched by something quieter yet stronger, and the commander noticed it in the way disputes among the men diminished, in the way their focus sharpened during drills, and in the way respect replaced arrogance when they spoke of marksmanship. Elena never sought to lead them, never barked orders or demanded recognition, yet they followed her example instinctively, watching the way she carried her rifle, the way she prepared before each shot, and even the way she chose silence over unnecessary words. In her silence they began to hear their own doubts, and in her steadiness they found a mirror reflecting what they could become. One morning the commander announced that preparations for the demonstration were entering their final phase, and with that came the pressure that always followed when higher command intended to observe. Normally such pressure frayed tempers, sharpened rivalries, and filled the air with boasting as each Marine tried to stake his claim as the best. But this time something unexpected happened. Rather than competing against one another, the men began to push each other toward refinement, sharing advice, correcting stances, practicing breathing together, and though the commander had tried for years to foster such camaraderie, it was Elena's quiet influence that had accomplished it in a matter of weeks. She never reminded them that she had beaten them all. She showed instead that the enemy was not each other but the flaws within, and slowly the culture of the unit began to change. Some nights, she sat by the fire pit with them, listening to their stories of deployment, of families waiting back home, of fears they rarely voiced to each other. She never interrupted, only listened, and they found in her a rare space where vulnerability was not weakness but relief. Dawson, once her loudest critic, became her most dedicated student. Every evening after drills he would stay behind on the range, adjusting his aim, forcing himself to breathe through frustration, and Elena would sometimes walk beside him, watching quietly until he asked for her insight. She never humiliated him, never reminded him of his arrogance, only guided him with small corrections. The tilt of his shoulder, the relaxation of his grip, the discipline to wait half a second longer before pulling the trigger. With each adjustment he felt himself improving, and though pride still lingered, it was no longer the brittle pride of superiority but the pride of growth. One night, after finally hitting a clean series at 600 yards, he lowered his rifle and turned to her, sweat glistening on his brow. "I used to think strength meant never being outdone," he confessed, his voice low. "But you've shown me it's about never stopping the work." Elena smiled faintly, a rare softness in her expression. "Then you've already outdone the man you were," she replied, and though the words were simple, they struck deeper than any medal he had ever earned. As the day of the demonstration drew nearer, rumors spread beyond the base. Other units heard whispers of a civilian woman who had humbled an entire line of Marines, and curiosity began to stir. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, a story twisted in retelling, but others grew eager to see her for themselves. The commander understood the significance of what was coming. If Elena succeeded again, it would not only change the reputation of his unit but ripple outward, reminding soldiers across the ranks that skill knew no boundary of uniform, gender, or expectation. He called her into his office once more, his expression grave. "You know they'll be watching you more than anyone else," he said. "Some will cheer if you succeed. Others will wait for you to falter, to prove the story was just a fluke." Elena listened calmly, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't shoot for them," she answered softly. "I shoot for the silence my father left. If they see something in it, that's their lesson, not mine." The commander studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then perhaps that's why you'll succeed. Because you carry more than yourself." On the morning of the demonstration, the base buzzed with an energy unlike any drill before. High-ranking officers arrived, their uniforms crisp, their eyes sharp with scrutiny, while enlisted men gathered at the edges of the range, eager to witness what had become legend. The targets were set at multiple distances, some standard, others extreme, chosen specifically to test not just accuracy but endurance and adaptability. The Marines lined up in full gear, their rifles gleaming, their faces set in determination, and among them stood Elena, plain as ever, her rifle slung with the same quiet reverence she had shown since the beginning. Some officers raised their brows at her presence, whispers circling like insects, yet the commander silenced them with a firm glance. The whistle blew and the first volley began. The Marines shot with precision sharper than ever before, their weeks of renewed discipline evident in every crack of their rifles. Groups were tight, accuracy undeniable, and as the observers nodded in approval, pride flickered in the commander's chest. When Elena stepped forward, the murmurs grew louder, but she paid them no mind. She raised her rifle, exhaled, and fired. The target at 300 yards shattered in the center. At 500, her bullet struck dead on. At 800, she adjusted for wind without hesitation, landing another clean shot. With each distance she conquered, the murmurs shifted from doubt to astonishment, until by the time she faced the 1,000-yard target, the crowd was silent, breathless. She closed her eyes for half a second, felt the memory of her father's hand steadying hers, and when she fired, the silence held until the spotter called out, "Bullseye." The range erupted, not with laughter, not with disbelief, but with applause and shouts of awe. Marines pounded their fists against their thighs in respect, officers exchanged glances heavy with recognition, and even those who had doubted could not deny what they had witnessed. Elena lowered her rifle calmly, her face unchanged, and simply stepped back into line as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, it was never about spectacle, it was about keeping a promise whispered years ago under the shade of the woods where her father had taught her. Yet for those who watched, it was more than a promise, it was a revelation. The jokes had died weeks ago, but now they were buried, replaced by respect carved in stone. That night, when the demonstration was over and the base quieted again, the commander found her walking alone near the wire. The stars stretched endless above and she stopped when he approached, waiting. He studied her silhouette for a moment before speaking. "You've done more than prove yourself. You've changed them. You've changed me. I've led men for decades, but you reminded me why we carry the rifle in the first place. Not for power. For discipline. For humility. For love." Elena's eyes softened, reflecting the starlight. "Then my father's voice hasn't been wasted," she said quietly. They stood together in silence, the night air heavy with unspoken understanding, and in that silence the promise of everything that had happened and everything still to come hung like a sacred weight. The weeks after the demonstration carried a different weight across the base, for what had begun as whispers of disbelief transformed into stories told with pride, not only by the Marines who had once doubted her but also by the officers who had arrived skeptical and left unable to erase the image of Elena Carter splitting targets at impossible distances with the steadiness of someone born from the rifle itself. The tale spread beyond the wire, traveling to nearby bases, to the ears of civilians, even drifting back toward her hometown where neighbors who had once dismissed her hours in the woods now spoke her name with a reverence they had never shown before. Elena herself remained unchanged in outward demeanor, refusing to let the noise of admiration distort her quiet discipline, but inside she felt the ripple of responsibility deepening, for she knew that every story told about her would one day be tested, and when the test came it would not be against cardboard silhouettes but against circumstances far heavier than pride. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the training grounds in hues of amber, Dawson approached her again, his face more solemn than before. He had improved greatly under her guidance, his shots tighter, his presence calmer, yet something restless lingered in his eyes. "They're calling you a legend," he said bluntly, his voice carrying both admiration and unease. Elena looked at him for a long moment before answering softly, "Legends are just stories people tell when they don't understand the work behind them. I'm no legend, Dawson. I'm just my father's student." He frowned, not fully satisfied with her humility, yet he sensed the truth in it, for he had seen her late at night, long after drills, still cleaning her rifle, still practicing her breathing as though perfection were a horizon she would never allow herself to reach. To him and many others, that was precisely what made her more than legend. Her refusal to believe she was anything more than a work in progress. The commander, recognizing the shift in morale her presence had created, began inviting Elena into planning discussions, not as an officer but as an observer whose perspective carried weight. She listened more than she spoke, offering her thoughts only when pressed, but when she did, her words cut through the noise with clarity that surprised even seasoned leaders. Once, when asked how to instill steadiness in a batch of recruits prone to panic during live fire, she said, "Teach them silence before you teach them bullets. If they can't hold their breath, they can't hold their fear." The room had gone quiet, officers exchanging glances, and from that day forward her phrase became a quiet mantra whispered during training, "Hold your breath, hold your fear." She never sought influence, yet it spread like fire, reshaping not only how the Marines shot but how they carried themselves in every exercise. Despite the growing respect, Elena felt the weight of isolation more keenly. She had been welcomed, yes, but she was not one of them, not bound by their ranks, their rituals, their unspoken brotherhood. At night in her quarters, she sometimes lay awake listening to the distant laughter from the barracks, laughter that excluded her not out of malice but out of the simple truth that she was different. She missed the simplicity of her hometown, the long walks through the woods, the steady companionship of her father's voice guiding her through the quiet. Here, surrounded by noise and expectation, she found herself yearning for that solitude even as she accepted that her path now stretched far from it. One evening, when the ache in her chest grew too heavy, she wandered again beyond the wire and lay beneath the stars, whispering into the night as though her father could hear her, "I don't know why I'm here but I'll carry you with me until I do." Unbeknownst to her, Dawson had followed at a distance once again. He had grown accustomed to her solitary walks, and though he never intruded without reason, this time something compelled him. When he found her lying in the grass, staring up at the sky, he hesitated before lowering himself beside her. For a long time neither spoke. Finally he broke the silence. "I used to think strength was about how loud you could be," he admitted. "Now I see it's about how quiet you can stand." Elena turned her head, studying him, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Then you're beginning to understand." He nodded slowly, his jaw tight as though swallowing unspoken words. "You've changed us," he said at last. "Changed me. And I keep wondering, what's it done to you?" She looked back at the stars, her eyes soft. It's made me carry more silence than ever. And silence is heavier than it looks. The bond between them deepened in subtle ways after that night, not in grand gestures but in the quiet understanding shared between two people who had once stood on opposite ends of pride. Dawson became her shadow in training, not to imitate but to learn, and slowly he grew into a steadiness that others began to notice. Some even whispered that she had shaped him into the best marksman among the enlisted, second only to herself, though Dawson never claimed such a title. Instead, he reminded others that everything he had gained came from her lessons, and his willingness to humble himself only heightened the respect both of them received. Still, Elena never allowed herself to forget that the admiration surrounding her was fragile, that all it would take was one failure to shatter the image others had built. She kept her heart guarded, her purpose clear. She was not there to be worshipped but to remind them of discipline. Then came the day when her resolve would be tested in ways none of them expected. A sudden call jolted the base into urgency. A training accident had spiraled out of control during live exercises in the nearby hills. A transport vehicle had overturned under fire simulations, leaving several young Marines stranded in exposed terrain as live rounds from automated turrets misfired due to a system malfunction. Panic rippled across the base as reports came in of soldiers pinned down, unable to move without risking their lives. The commander ordered immediate action, but chaos hindered organization. In the confusion, Dawson sprinted to Elena's quarters, breathless. "They need a shooter," he said quickly. "Someone who can hit the control nodes from distance. Someone steady." Without hesitation, Elena rose, slinging her rifle across her shoulder, her eyes already sharp. "Show me where," she said, and together they rushed toward the transport waiting at the gate. The ride to the hills was tense, the engine growling as dust rose around them. The Marines inside the vehicle looked at Elena with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, for though she was not one of them, her presence had become a symbol of calm in chaos. When they arrived at the site, the scene unfolded with brutal clarity. Smoke curling from the overturned vehicle, young Marines crouched behind scraps of cover, and automated turrets still whirring, spitting bursts of live ammunition across the field with deadly precision. The commander's voice crackled over the comms, ordering them to disable the system before lives were lost. Elena dropped to the ground, unstrapping her rifle, her hands steady despite the chaos. Dawson crouched beside her, scanning the terrain. "Control nodes are small," he warned. "Half the size of a fist. At least 700 yards. Elena only nodded, her breathing already slowing, her focus narrowing until the chaos faded into silence. She lined up her first shot, exhaled and squeezed. The crack echoed and one turret went dead. Another adjustment, another shot, and the second collapsed in sparks. One by one she dismantled the threat, her rifle singing through the storm, until the last turret fell silent and the pinned Marines scrambled free, alive but shaken. When the dust settled and the danger passed, the young men she had saved looked at her not as an outsider, not as a legend, but as the reason they still breathed. Dawson stood beside her, pride shining in his eyes, though he said nothing, for words felt too small against the enormity of what they had just witnessed. Elena lowered her rifle, her expression calm but her chest heavy with the weight of lives carried. She had never wanted to prove herself through spectacle, but in that moment she understood that sometimes the silence one carried was not just a lesson, it was salvation. The day after the announcement of the joint trial between the top-ranked Marines and Elena, the air around the base shifted in a way that no one could quite describe but everyone could feel. Jokes still floated around, whispered between squads and carried by those who couldn't resist mocking the idea of a civilian outshining seasoned professionals, yet beneath the laughter was something new, curiosity mixed with unease. Even those who had once laughed the loudest found themselves watching her with narrowed eyes, searching for the trick, the weakness, the detail that would explain what they had witnessed at the shooting range. For Elena herself, the shift was harder to ignore than ever, but instead of retreating as she had done in the past, she pressed forward with a determination that surprised even her. She trained quietly in the corner of the gym, keeping her focus inward, her movements precise, and though some Marines tried to break her concentration with sneers or whispered remarks, the way she ignored them only seemed to highlight her growing presence. By the time night fell, her story was being told in barracks across the camp, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some said she had shattered records that had stood for years, others insisted she must have been secretly trained by special forces, and still others dismissed her completely, claiming it had been a fluke. But regardless of the version, her name was being spoken, and that meant she could no longer hide in the shadows as she once had. When the day of the trial arrived, the entire training yard was transformed into an arena of sorts. Marines lined the edges, some perched on vehicles, others standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Officers had gathered as well, drawn by both the novelty of the challenge and the underlying question of what it might mean if this young woman succeeded again. Elena stood at one end of the course, her rifle slung across her back, her stance steady though her heart pounded with a rhythm that reminded her of every time she had been underestimated in her life. Across from her stood the line of Marines, 15 of the best marksmen in the base, each with years of experience and reputations built on precision. Their expressions varied. Some grinned with easy confidence, others looked at her with veiled annoyance, but a few carried a hint of caution, remembering what they had seen before. The challenge was simple but brutal, an extended obstacle course filled with targets that appeared and vanished at unpredictable intervals, each one designed to test not only accuracy but stamina, adaptability, and composure under pressure. It wasn't just about shooting, it was about maintaining focus through exhaustion, about reading the rhythm of the test and outlasting opponents who were trained to endure. The signal was given and the course exploded into chaos. Marines surged forward, boots pounding against the dirt, rifles raised as the first set of targets popped into view. Elena moved among them, her breath steady, her mind narrowing until the noise of the crowd and the thunder of boots faded away. She fired, each shot clean, each target falling without hesitation. To her right, 2 Marines were already missing their marks, their frustration visible as they adjusted and reloaded. To her left, another cursed under his breath as his target vanished before he could take the shot. Elena didn't allow herself the distraction of comparison. She flowed from one target to the next, as if the course was something she had walked in dreams 1,000 times before. Sweat rolled down her back as she vaulted a barrier, rolled, came up firing, and dropped 3 moving targets in less than 2 seconds. The crowd roared, the sound swelling like a wave, but still she heard nothing but the quiet certainty within her chest that told her she belonged here. As the minutes stretched on, the trial thinned the line of Marines. Some fell behind, winded and unable to keep pace with the relentless pace of the course. Others managed the endurance but stumbled on precision, their shots slipping just wide of their marks as fatigue gnawed at their control. Elena pressed forward, her body aching, her arms heavy, but her focus unshaken. Every time she raised her rifle, the world seemed to still for the briefest heartbeat, and when she fired, the target always fell. One by one, the Marines began to glance her way, disbelief etched into their expressions as they realized she wasn't just keeping up, she was pulling ahead. By the halfway mark, she was leading, her accuracy unbroken, her endurance startling even the officers who had doubted her. And yet she didn't allow herself to think of it as winning. To her, it was survival, a chance to prove to herself as much as to them that the scars of her past had not been chains but fuel. The final stretch of the course was the most brutal, a series of elevated platforms, each one requiring a climb, a jump, or a balance across narrow beams, with targets appearing at odd angles and unpredictable distances. Marines cursed as they slipped, some scrambling back into position, others taking hurried shots that missed their marks entirely. Elena's hands burned from the rope as she pulled herself upward, her muscles screaming for rest, but she refused to slow. At the top, a target swung into view, barely visible against the backdrop of the crowd, and she fired before the motion could distract her, dropping it cleanly. She leapt across to the next platform, rolled and fired again, her body moving on instinct now. The final target appeared, a small circle at a near impossible distance, and for a split second the crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable miss. Elena raised her rifle, exhaled slowly and let the shot fly. Silence followed, so complete it seemed as though the entire base had frozen. Then the target shattered, and the silence collapsed into a roar so loud it shook her chest. When she lowered her rifle, her arms trembling with exhaustion, she realized she was alone at the finish line. The Marines who had entered beside her were still behind, still fighting the course, still missing shots. She had finished first, flawless, her record untarnished. The officers exchanged glances, some with disbelief, others with grudging respect. The Marines who had mocked her now stood in stunned silence, their confidence shattered by what they had witnessed. She wanted to collapse, to let the weight of exhaustion drag her to the ground, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet their eyes, because she knew this was the moment that mattered most. To falter now would be to give them back their power. Instead, she stood like steel, sweat-soaked and trembling but unbroken. The commanding officer stepped forward, his voice carrying over the din. He announced the results with a tone that carried no room for doubt. Elena had not only beaten the Marines, she had set a new course record. The words echoed through the crowd, and for the first time since she had arrived at the base, the laughter that usually followed her name was gone. In its place was something heavier, sharper, respect mixed with awe. For many, it was an uncomfortable shift, forcing them to confront the idea that their assumptions had been wrong, that their ridicule had been misplaced. For others, it was a spark of inspiration, proof that strength could appear in forms they hadn't expected. And for Elena, it was a moment of quiet triumph, not because she had proven them wrong, but because she had proven herself right. That night, the camp was alive with whispers of her victory. Some spoke of it with bitterness, unable to accept what they had seen. Others told the story with excitement, their words carrying admiration even if they didn't yet realize it. Elena sat alone under the stars, her body aching, her mind replaying every moment of the trial. She thought of the path that had brought her here, the losses, the pain, the endless fight to be taken seriously, and for the first time she felt that the weight of it had been worth carrying. She had outshot the Marine line not just with skill, but with the strength of every scar she bore. And though tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubts, she knew one truth above all others. The jokes had fallen silent, and in that silence she had finally been heard. The morning after her record-breaking victory, Elena woke to a camp that felt strangely different. The familiar murmurs that used to trail behind her as she walked past were no longer filled with mockery but with quiet speculation, and though the shift was subtle, it carried a weight she could feel in every glance. Some Marines now looked at her with genuine respect, offering small nods they might have once reserved only for one another. Others stared with suspicion, as if trying to solve the riddle of how she had managed to shatter the reputation of their best shooters. And then there were those who could not accept it at all, who muttered bitterly under their breath and avoided her gaze entirely, their pride wounded by the truth they could not deny. For Elena, the change was unsettling, but it also gave her a strange sense of relief. She had not asked for their approval, but after years of being dismissed and underestimated, she finally walked among them without carrying the sting of constant ridicule. She wasn't blind to the new tension, though. She knew respect was fragile, and one stumble could return her to being the subject of laughter. That awareness pressed on her like a new weight, urging her not to falter. The officers wasted no time capitalizing on her performance. That same day she was summoned to the briefing hall, where high-ranking figures who had once ignored her now regarded her with interest. They asked her about her training, about how she had developed her precision, about what methods she used to maintain composure under pressure. Their questions came rapid, one after another, and she answered as best she could, though she could sense the undercurrent behind their curiosity. They wanted to know if she was an anomaly, a lucky shot who had performed beyond her ability once, or if she was something more, someone who could raise the bar for everyone around her. Elena spoke honestly, telling them she had trained alone for years, pushing herself in silence because she had no one to believe in her. Some of the officers listened with interest, while others clearly doubted her explanation, unwilling to accept that sheer determination could rival years of military training. When the meeting ended, she left with the distinct feeling that her future was being quietly debated behind closed doors, her name now a question mark in the minds of those who held power. Meanwhile, among the Marines, her victory sparked a wave of competition. Some wanted to challenge her directly, convinced they could reclaim their pride by besting her in smaller trials. Others studied her movements during practice, trying to mimic her technique or learn the secret to her focus. A few even approached her with cautious respect, asking for tips or advice, though she could see in their eyes that the request carried as much pride as it did humility. Elena responded with measured patience, sharing what she could without flaunting her skill, because she knew any sign of arrogance would turn respect back into resentment. Still, she couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. For the first time, she was no longer an outsider pressing her face against the glass. She had forced her way into their world, and though not all of them welcomed her, none could deny her place anymore. But with recognition came new challenges, ones she had not anticipated. The pressure to maintain her performance grew heavier with every passing day, and though she tried to push it aside, she felt the eyes on her constantly. In training, even the smallest slip of focus drew whispers, as if the camp waited for proof that her success had been nothing more than luck. The stress ate at her during sleepless nights, when she lay awake replaying the trial in her mind, wondering if she had already reached her peak. She forced herself to train harder, to sharpen every skill until her body ached, but in the quiet moments between drills, she found herself haunted by a question she couldn't ignore. Was she proving her worth to them, or was she still trying to prove it to herself? The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, because deep down she knew the scars of her past were not so easily erased, and no victory could fully silence the doubts she carried inside. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the yard in golden light, A Marine named Callan approached her. He was one of the few who had watched her trial without mockery, his expression unreadable, and now he stood before her with a calmness that immediately put her on edge. He asked her to join him in a private drill, not as a challenge but as a way to learn. His request surprised her. Pride rarely allowed Marines of his caliber to admit they wanted help, let alone from someone they had once dismissed. For a long moment she considered refusing, wary of being set up for humiliation, but something in his eyes told her it was genuine. So she agreed, and together they trained under the fading light, their rifles echoing across the yard as the targets fell one by one. Callan didn't just ask about technique. He asked about focus, about the way she steadied her breath, about the mindset that allowed her to treat each shot as though it were the only one that mattered. In those hours she realized something she hadn't before. Her gift wasn't only in precision, but in the way she carried herself through pressure, the way she turned chaos into clarity. Word of their training spread quickly, and soon others began to join, forming an unlikely group around her. What had begun as mockery evolved into reluctant admiration, and what started with one Marine grew into several, until she found herself teaching small squads in the evenings. The irony wasn't lost on her, that the same voices which once laughed at her were now listening for guidance, but instead of resenting it, she embraced the opportunity. She taught them not only the mechanics of shooting but the patience, the discipline, the quiet resilience that had carried her through years of doubt. And as she taught, she began to heal parts of herself she hadn't realized were still raw, because in giving them strength she was finally learning to see her own not as an accident, but as something real, something earned. Yet even as this new respect grew, shadows lingered. Not everyone welcomed her rising influence, and she could sense the unease in certain officers who saw her as a disruption to tradition. Whispers reached her ears of closed-door conversations, of concerns that her presence undermined the authority of those who had spent years building their reputations. Some Marines, too, resented the way others gravitated toward her, interpreting it as favoritism or weakness. Elena felt the shift like a storm brewing on the horizon, invisible but undeniable. She knew her journey was far from over, and that the silence she had won could easily turn back into laughter, or worse, if she wasn't careful. But for the first time she didn't fear it. Because now, when she looked around, she saw not a wall of ridicule pressing against her, but cracks in it, cracks she had made herself, and through them, a glimpse of something brighter waiting to break through. As the night deepened, she sat alone on the steps of the barracks, the stars glimmering above. Her body ached, her mind heavy, but her spirit burned with something unfamiliar yet powerful: hope. The jokes had fallen silent, yes, but in their silence she had discovered more than respect. She had found the beginning of belonging, the first fragile threads of connection with those who had once doubted her. And though she knew storms were still ahead, she also knew this truth: no matter what came, she would never again walk quietly in their shadow. She had claimed her place, and no amount of laughter or doubt could ever erase it. Weeks passed, and the base settled into a rhythm that no longer excluded Elena. Where once she had been the target of jokes, now she was the subject of watchful eyes, some filled with respect, some with envy, but all acknowledging her presence. She trained daily, her body growing sharper, her movements more precise, yet her true growth came not in skill but in the way she carried herself among the Marines. For the first time she allowed herself to speak without hesitation, to share thoughts openly, and though her words were simple, they carried weight. Marines who had once laughed at her now listened, and officers who had dismissed her began to seek her opinion during debriefings. But with recognition came responsibility, and that responsibility soon revealed itself in a way she hadn't expected. One evening she was summoned to the commanding officer's quarters. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, the faces of senior officers gathered in quiet seriousness. They explained that tensions along the border had grown unstable, and that a field exercise was being escalated into a live deployment. Elena's name had been put forward not just as a participant, but as a test, to see if her abilities could stand not against paper targets, but against the chaos of real conflict. The announcement hit her like a stone in the chest. She had dreamed of proving herself, but dreams were different from reality, and for the first time she questioned whether her silence-shattering performance at the range had prepared her for the unforgiving truth of combat. That night she could not sleep. The barracks were quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of boots in the hallway, but inside her mind there was no peace. She thought of the Marines who would stand beside her, men and women who had years of experience in battle. She thought of the whispers that would follow if she failed, that her victory in training had been a fluke, that she was nothing more than a fortunate anomaly. But she also thought of the weight she carried, the years of laughter she had endured, and the moment she had finally silenced it. That memory burned within her, not as pride but as a reminder that she had already done what they thought impossible once. Perhaps she could do it again. By dawn, her decision was clear. Fear would not be her answer. She would go. The deployment began at first light. The squad was flown out to the borderlands, a region scarred by old conflicts, where the silence of abandoned villages was broken only by the wind and the distant crack of occasional gunfire. Elena stepped off the transport with her rifle slung across her chest, the weight both familiar and foreign in this new setting. The squad leader barked orders, assigning positions, and though no one openly questioned her presence, she felt their eyes on her, testing, measuring. The mission was to secure a high ridge overlooking the valley, a position that had been contested for weeks. It was not meant to be easy, and every Marine there knew it. As they moved, Elena kept her focus sharp, her senses tuned to every shift in the terrain, every sound carried by the wind. When the first shots rang out, her heart clenched, but training took over. She dropped into cover, sighted her target, and fired. The figure in the distance fell, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. This was no range, no trial. This was life and death, and yet the clarity that had carried her before still guided her hand. The firefight stretched into hours. The Marines fought with grit, their movements practiced and sharp, and Elena moved among them not as an outsider but as one of their own. She covered flanks, picked off hidden threats, and held her ground even when the pressure threatened to break her. The squad leader, who had given her only curt nods before, now called her name with trust, directing her to key positions because her shots never missed. Slowly the tide turned. The ridge was secured, the valley quieted, and when the sun dipped low, the squad stood bloodied but unbroken. Among them, Elena stood too, her hands trembling not from failure but from the weight of what she had just survived. She had faced the chaos and had not faltered. Back at the base, the story of the mission spread quickly. Marines who had doubted her now told others of the way she had held the line, of the shots she had made that saved their advance. It wasn't exaggerated legend, it was testimony from those who had fought beside her, voices that carried more weight than rumor ever could. Respect deepened, not because she had embarrassed them in training, but because she had stood with them in battle and proved she was no less than any of them. And yet, as the recognition grew, Elena herself remained quiet. She carried the memories of the fallen, the images of the fight, and she knew that this respect was built not on spectacle but on survival. It was a heavy truth, but one she accepted. In the days that followed, she noticed another change. Where before she had trained alone, now Marines sought her company not just for her skill but for her presence. Conversations that had once excluded her now opened to her, and even laughter, once her greatest enemy, now found her in a different way. It was no longer cruel or dismissive, but genuine, shared between comrades who had bled together. She learned to smile again, cautiously at first, then more freely, realizing that laughter did not always have to wound. For the first time in years, she felt the beginnings of belonging not as something forced, but as something earned. Yet even amid this newfound acceptance, Elena knew her journey was far from finished. The officers continued to watch her, their interest sharper than ever, and whispers of new assignments reached her ears. She was no longer invisible, and invisibility had once been her shield. Now she stood in the open, and with that came both opportunity and danger. She did not know where the path ahead would lead, whether toward greater trials or greater threats, but she understood something she hadn't before. Every scar, every moment of doubt, every ounce of pain she had endured had not been wasted. They had forged her into someone capable of standing where she stood now, someone who could silence laughter not with words but with undeniable truth. As she sat alone one night beneath the stars, her rifle resting across her knees, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who walked past lines of Marines with her head bowed as jokes followed her steps. She thought of the woman she was becoming, standing tall even in the fire of battle. And she realized that while the world around her had changed, the most important change had been within herself. She no longer sought to prove her worth to those who doubted her, because she no longer doubted it herself. The silence she had created was not just theirs, it was hers, the quiet within her soul that told her she had finally found her place. Time passed and Elena's name became something more than a whispered oddity in the camp. It became a marker of change, a story retold with growing reverence, until even recruits who had never witnessed her first victory spoke of her as if they had seen it themselves. But alongside the respect, there grew expectation, and expectation was its own kind of burden. The officers placed her in more operations, always watching closely, as though waiting to confirm whether her abilities were repeatable or if she would one day stumble and shatter the legend they were beginning to build around her. She accepted each mission with steady resolve, not because she sought their approval but because she understood that every chance was a test, and every test was a chance to redefine what she had once been. Through each deployment, she carried herself with the same quiet clarity, her shots unerring, her composure unshaken, until even those who had resisted the idea of her belonging could not deny the truth of what she had become. And yet, for all the victories, Elena remained cautious. She knew better than anyone how quickly laughter could return, how fragile respect could be if trust was broken. She carried this knowledge like armor, never allowing herself the comfort of complacency. One evening, as the camp settled into the usual hum of voices and clattering mess kits, she was called once more into the commanding officer's quarters. This time the tone was heavier, the faces sterner. A larger mission loomed, one not of securing ridges or holding lines but of leading. Elena listened as the plan was laid before her. She would not just participate, she would command a mixed unit of seasoned Marines, responsible for their safety, their success, their survival. The weight of the assignment pressed down on her like iron. To be accepted as a shooter was one thing, to be trusted as a leader was another entirely. The officers made it clear, this was the ultimate test, one that would either cement her place or strip away everything she had built. For a long moment she stood in silence, her heart caught between fear and determination. Then she nodded, knowing there could be no retreat now. She had fought too hard to be heard, and this was the voice they had finally given her. The days leading to the mission were filled with preparation. She trained alongside the Marines she would command, pushing them as hard as she pushed herself, not with arrogance but with a steady, quiet conviction that spoke louder than any speech. Some resisted her at first, unwilling to accept orders from someone who had once been the subject of their jokes, but resistance weakened when they saw the way she carried herself, the way she never asked of them what she was unwilling to do herself. She rose before dawn, ran drills until her body ached, and fired until her hands were raw. Slowly, grudgingly, the Marines began to see her not just as an anomaly but as someone worthy of standing at their front. By the time the transport lifted them into the air, the tension had shifted into a silent, unified focus. The mission itself was brutal. They were sent deep into contested territory, tasked with dismantling an enemy stronghold that had resisted multiple assaults. The terrain was unforgiving, the opposition fierce, and every decision Elena made carried consequences that weighed on her shoulders heavier than the rifle she carried. She moved with her unit through smoke and fire, her voice steady as she directed their paths, her rifle still precise even as chaos erupted around them. At times, fear clawed at her throat, threatening to choke her, but she forced it down, remembering that every set of eyes looked to her not for perfection but for resolve. And resolve she gave them even when the night stretched on and the battle seemed endless. There came a moment at the height of the fight, when they were pinned, outnumbered and pressed against a crumbling wall. The Marines looked to her, breaths ragged, doubt flickering in their eyes, and in that instant she felt the weight of every joke, every sneer, every dismissal she had endured. She could hear them in her memory, the voices that once told her she would never stand among them. And with that memory came fire. She rose from cover, her rifle steady, her eyes sharp, and with a calm born from years of carrying doubt, she began to fire. Each shot struck true, breaking the pressure on their flank, buying her unit the space they needed. Her voice cut through the chaos, commanding, guiding, pushing them forward. The Marines surged with her, their fear dissolving in the face of her certainty, and together they broke the line that had held them. By dawn the stronghold was theirs. Smoke hung heavy in the air, bodies lay scattered across the ground, and exhaustion weighed on every soldier like chains. But they were alive and they had succeeded. Elena stood at the center of it, her uniform torn, her hands shaking, her body aching with every breath, but her eyes steady. Around her, the Marines she had led looked at her with something beyond respect, trust, gratitude, and a quiet acknowledgement that went deeper than words. She had not only outshot them, she had led them, carried them through fire, and brought them out the other side. In that moment she understood that her journey had shifted once more. She was no longer proving herself only as a marksman. She had become something greater. When they returned to base, the silence that followed her was no longer the silence of disbelief but of reverence. Marines who had once mocked her now saluted her without hesitation, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The officers who had once questioned her now spoke her name with certainty, no longer a gamble but a guarantee. For Elena, the transformation was surreal, and yet she accepted it with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. She knew there would always be challenges, always be those who doubted, But she also knew she no longer needed to fight for every inch of ground. She had claimed it and it was hers. That night, as she sat once more beneath the stars, she thought of the path behind her. She thought of the laughter that had once followed her, of the silence that had replaced it, and of the voices that now spoke her name with pride. She realized that she had never been fighting only for herself. Every woman who had been doubted, every soldier who had been underestimated, every person who had carried scars of ridicule could see in her a reflection of their own battles. Her victory was theirs too. And in that thought she found peace. The jokes had fallen silent long ago, but in their silence, something greater had grown. Respect, trust, belonging. She had once believed her scars were chains, but now she saw them as proof of survival, of strength forged in fire. And as the stars burned above her, Elena smiled, not because she had outshot the Marine line, not because she had led them through battle, but because she had finally silenced the doubts within herself. That silence was louder than any roar, more powerful than any weapon, and it would carry her forward into whatever battles lay ahead. The end.